for calm. As we move to the statement on Ukraine, Secretary of State for Defence, Grant Shapps.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to update the House on the current conflict in Ukraine as we prepare to mark 2 years since the start of the full-scale Russian invasion. Like many in this House, I remember exactly where I was on the 24th of February 2022. Just before sunrise, I was woken by a phone call to be told that Russia had illegally invaded Ukraine. The car would be outside at 6 a.m. and headed for Cobra. After that meeting, ministers were all asked to speak to their respective Ukrainian counterparts. At the time, I was Transport Secretary, and my arrangement was to speak via Zoom with my then opposite number, Alexandra Kubrakov. Alexandra, whom subsequently I've got to know very well, was standing in the middle of a field outside of Kyiv. I asked him about the situation, and he told me that, quite frankly, he didn't know how much longer the city would last. The Russian army was understood to be just kilometres away. The wolf, or in this case the Russian bear, was literally at the door. An expert opinion suggested Kyiv would be taken in perhaps 3 days' time. And yet, as this war drags into its third year, far from winning, Russia has been pushed back from those early days. Putin has achieved none of his strategic objectives. His invading force has suffered a staggering 356,000 casualties. Ukraine has destroyed or damaged around 30% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and Ukraine has retaken 50% of the territory that Russia stole from it. Meanwhile, Alexander Kubrakov is now the Deputy Prime Minister, and his job is actually the restoration of Ukraine when this is over. So Putin arrogantly assumed that this conflict would be over in days, and he was wrong. He reckoned without the strength of the international support that would rally to Ukraine's cause. And I am proud that, over the course of the past 730 days, Britain has been at the forefront of that global response. Our efforts, always a step ahead of our allies, has made a genuine difference. And from the outset, we declassified intelligence, specifically to scupper Russian false flags. Our NLAW anti-tank missiles provided in advance of the full-scale invasion, and our javelins have helped brave Ukrainians devastate Putin's menacing 40-mile armoured convoy, which was headed direct for Kyiv. We were the first to send main battle tanks with our Challenger squadron, plus 500 armoured vehicles and 15,000 anti-armour weapons. All of this helped to degrade Russia's once formidable fighting force, with Putin's losses amounting to 2,700 main battle tanks, 5,300 armoured vehicles, 1,400 artillery pieces. Throughout this conflict, our 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition have allowed Ukraine to maintain a rate of fire, and recently helped keep the Russians at bay during their winter offensive. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has been unable to achieve the air superiority that they'd assumed they'd have, in part thanks to our donation of 1,800 air defence missiles. And over 4,000 British drones have been sent to date. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, this conflict has indeed demonstrated that drones are changing the face of modern warfare. And we're already learning the lessons from that, which is why earlier today my honourable friend, the Defence Procurement Minister, launched the UK Defence Drone Strategy to stay ahead on this new frontier of technology, backed by at least £200 million announced by the Prime Minister recently, making the UK the biggest drone partner for Ukraine. Yet, it's actually at sea where the Allied contribution to Ukraine's cause has been most keenly felt. Our mighty storm shadows and our uncrewed sea systems have helped Ukraine achieve a breakthrough in the Black Sea. Not only has Russia lost fleets of 7 different surface ships plus a submarine, but a Black Sea corridor has opened up for trade, allowing Ukraine to export 19 million tonnes of cargo, including 13.4 million tonnes of agricultural produce. At the end of last month, Ukrainian agricultural exports from its Black Sea ports have reached the highest level since when the war began, far exceeding what happened under Putin's Black Sea grain initiative. But as President Zelensky said to me when I visited, the UK's contribution has been monumental. And he pointed out that since the start of the conflict, the UK has sent almost 400 different types of capabilities to Ukraine. Together we've shown that when Ukraine gets what it needs, it can win, which is why the UK is continuing to step up our support. Last month, the Prime Minister announced we'll be investing a further £2.5 billion into military support for Ukraine, taking our total military package so far to over £7 billion, and our total support to over £12 billion, accounting for economic and humanitarian as well. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in that spirit, today I can announce a new package of 200 Brimstone anti-tank missiles in a further boost to defend Ukraine. These missiles have previously had significant impact on the battlefield, in one instance forcing Russian forces to abandon and retreat in an attempted crossing of a river. But members will recall, a few days ago, President Zelensky told the Munich Security Conference that an artificial deficit of weapons will only help Russia. And he is right. And so today, we're giving Ukraine more of the help they need, inflating their capabilities so they can defend freedom's front line. Other capabilities will also be coming their way too. Our UK-founded and administered International Fund for Ukraine has pledged more than £900 million to help Ukraine plug its gaps in its capabilities, delivering cutting-edge drones, along with electronic warfare, mine clearance capabilities, with millions worth of kit to come. And we're not just investing in weapons, but in the brave personnel who serve as well. Mr. Deputy Speaker, so far Britain has put more than 60,000 Ukrainian troops through their paces here in the UK. But Operation Interflex, our main training effort, is going to expand even further. I'm delighted to announce that Kosovo and Estonia are joining. And they've joined with us, Australia, Canada, Denmark, New Zealand, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Lithuania and Romania, all training Ukrainian troops here in Britain. And together we'll train a further 10,000 in the first half of 2024. And meanwhile, we're building the capability coalitions. Alongside Norway, we're leading a maritime capability coalition. We've been joined by a dozen other countries in this enterprise. Now, this is about mine detection drones, raiding crafts, seeking helicopters which have already been sent their way, so Ukraine can build its navy and defend its sovereign waters. Last week, I met with my NATO counterparts in Brussels, and I announced together with Latvia that we would lead the drone coalition. That will allow us to scale up and streamline the West's provision of miniature first-person view, or FPV, drones to Ukraine, while supporting the establishment of a drone school for Ukrainian operators and test range, as well as developing AI swarm drone technology, which will surely be critical in the next phase of this war. Britain's earmarked some £200 million to procure and produce long-range strike and sea drones, and become Ukraine's largest supplier of drones. Yet this is far from the summit of our ambitions. In December, we set up a new task force to build a strong defence industrial partnership with Ukraine, ensuring Ukraine can sustain the fight for years to come. And in January, the Prime Minister signed the historic Security Cooperation Agreement. This is the start of a 100-year alliance that we're building with our Ukrainian friends. And once again, it's the United Kingdom that has signed the first such agreement, with welcome signings from France and Germany having followed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Ukrainians have the will and they have the skills, and they've shown that if they're given the tools, they can do the job. But their need today remains particularly urgent. Russia is continuing to attack along almost the entire front line, only recently decimating and then capturing the eastern town of Advika. The Kremlin continues to callously strike at civilian targets, and most recently hitting a hospital in Seladov. And Putin is making absolutely no secret whatsoever of being in this for the long term. Russia's economy has indeed shifted onto a full-time war footing, spending some 30% of their federal expenditure on their defence. A nominal increase of almost 70% just on last year alone. And if the cruel death of the remarkable, brave Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, has taught us anything at all, it is that Putin's victory is something that none of us can afford. The tyrant of the Kremlin is determined to simply wait out the West. He believes that we lack the stomach for the fight, and we must show him that we are wrong. And this House may not be united on all matters, as we've seen in the last 24 hours, but we are united on one thing, and that is our support for Ukraine. So the UK will continue to double down on that support, and all freedom-loving countries must be compelled to do the same. This year will be make or break for Ukraine, so it's time for the West and all civilised nations to step up and give Ukraine the backing it needs. 2 years ago, when I spoke to an anxious Alexander Kubrakov, who'd retreated to that field outside Kyiv, he did not know what would happen to Ukraine. But now, entering the third year of this conflict, it is remarkable to see that Ukrainians remain in full fight. I know the whole House will join me in saying that the UK won't stop supporting the brave Ukrainians, our friends, until they have won and have victory.
Thank you. I mean, just for the record, I think you may... and thank you for that, but I think you may have misspoken when you said we must show him he is wrong again. I think that's what you intended to say. I know the front bench were smiling. I believe you said we are wrong. So I'm just...
I'm taking the opportunity to correct we to he, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for the avoidance of any doubt.
I'm sure Hansard can correct that we must show him he is wrong again, as it says in the statement. Thank you very much. Mr. Healey.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the Defence Secretary for this statement. It is his first statement on Ukraine, but he could not have chosen a more important moment as we mark 2 years since President Putin's brutal, illegal invasion began. 2 years in which cities have been smashed, hospitals hit by missiles, power plants bombed, civilians raped, and children abducted to Russia. 2 years of war in Europe that has shattered wider European security. And his statement today gives this House, on behalf of the British public, a chance to show that the UK is totally united, totally committed in support of Ukraine, as they fight for their freedoms, for their territorial integrity, and the right as a democratic country to decide their own future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes to win. We know this is the strong message that the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary convey to Ukraine. And when the Labour leader met President Zelensky in Kyiv last year, he said, on military help for Ukraine and on reinforcing NATO allies, the UK government has had and will continue to have the fullest Labour support. And 2 years on, I'm proud the UK continues to be united on Ukraine. Proud that British families have opened up their homes to Ukrainians fleeing Putin's war. Proud that people across Britain, in all walks of life, have organised donations and deliveries of assistance to Ukraine. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Ukrainians are fighting with huge courage, military and civilians alike. They've regained half the territory taken by Putin. They've disabled his Black Sea fleet. They've developed new weapons at record speed. But Russia is far from a spent force, and if Putin wins, he will not stop at Ukraine. The Defence Secretary this afternoon has mentioned Avdiivka. The forced Ukrainian withdrawal there is a warning to the West. They had the heart to fight, but they did not have the ammunition. And so as Russia steps up its war effort, as the Defence Secretary has said, so we must step up UK support. Because Putin is not just fighting on the battlefield. This is a war on the diplomatic front, the economic front, and the industrial front, a struggle on all fronts against Russian aggression. And we need a broad UK plan to help defend Ukraine and defeat Putin. So first, ramp up military support throughout 2024 and beyond by implementing the UK agreement, extending UK training and creating a clear path for Ukraine's NATO membership. Second, reboot the diplomatic drive to maintain Western unity and support and hold Putin to account by working through the G7, the UN, NATO, the International Criminal Court and a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. Third, take immediate action against wider Russian aggression by enforcing sanctions, closing loopholes in the supply chain and reinforcing NATO allies on the Russian border. Fourth, Mr. Deputy Speaker, boost UK industrial production by fast-tracking in full the spring budget's £2 billion to restock UK armed forces and Ukraine. And fifth, get ready for Ukraine's recovery by more demining help and enabling seized or frozen Russian state assets to be used for Ukraine reconstruction. Mr. Deputy Speaker, defence of the UK starts in Ukraine, and I'm proud of UK leadership on Ukraine. I want still to be proud in 6 months' time. So can I press the Defence Secretary? We welcome the extra 200 Brimstone anti-tank missiles. Will he now go beyond these ad hoc announcements and set out a fuller military aid action plan? We welcomed the 2.5 billion for 2024. Will every pound be spent on Ukraine and not on UK operational costs at NATO bases? We strongly endorsed the UK-Ukraine Security Cooperation Agreement. So will he now follow that up with an implementation plan so that Ukraine gets the urgent and the sustained help it needs? And finally, we backed the Ukrainian homes and visa schemes. Will the government rethink its decision this week, with no consultation and no notice, to close the family's visa scheme? In conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Ukrainians are watching elections around the world very closely this year. That's why, when he met President Zelensky, the Labour leader pledged on behalf of Britain there could be a change in government this year, but there will be no change in Britain's resolve to stand with Ukraine, confront Russian aggression and pursue Putin for his war crimes.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his support, and indeed all members of this House from all parties, for the tremendous support that Ukraine has experienced from this Parliament. Whatever else, as I said, are divisions, and no one should be in any doubt whatsoever about the united voice with which we speak on this subject. He's absolutely right to mention about the exceptional work that's been done with the training. I imagine he's probably seen some of the Interflex training for himself and there is no greater pride than going with other world leaders to go and see their own trainers training and doing it here in the UK. It's something we'll be truly proud of, and we will be doing more of, as I mentioned. He's right too about NATO membership as the ultimate path for Ukraine. We have the 75th anniversary of NATO coming up in the summer in Washington DC, and it's very important that the West helps to set that path for Ukraine's membership even more firmly. He'll be pleased to hear that my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, is working on the legal matters very proactively, as is the Chancellor and the Prime Minister on sanctions, as well as the Foreign Minister on sanctions, which will only work, as some of the recent reporting shows, if it's done in a collective manner, including the G7 and other bodies. He asked about a military action plan. I just want to sort of let him know that in conversations with my opposite number, that's Minister Umerov, as well as President Zelensky and others, what they really want is for us to privately work with them on the £2.5 billion. That's what we're doing. There are strategic reasons for not producing a published plan around it. They will release information to the House as appropriate, but for military reasons to do it rather differently on this occasion. It is the case, though, and I want to reassure him about this, that not only do we spend the published amount, we go over and above that in a variety of different ways. He is right about the partnership cooperation agreement and the importance of that, and there we will be publishing a whole series of follow-ups. For example, one of the measures is to teach English language as the second language for Ukraine. And I know, talking to my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, that there are 100 universities in the process of being linked to Ukrainian institutions in order to press that plan forward, and much else besides involved with that security cooperation agreement. And lastly, he mentions the family visa scheme for Ukrainians. As he will know, I had a Ukrainian family of 3 and their dog lived with us for a year after the invasion, and they're still living in this country. They're very, very keen to return home to build Ukraine back when this war ends. In the meantime, this government has put in place further visa arrangements, which are amongst, if not the most generous in the world. And I know, speaking to the family who lived with me, they were delighted with that statement by the Home Secretary recently.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, sir. The Defence Secretary has recently drawn parallels with the 1930s. He spoke powerfully at Lancaster House about our transition from a post-war world to a pre-war one. In similar vein, I was part of a Conservative Friends of Ukraine delegation to Congress recently to lobby congressmen to support the aid package. In one such conversation, a Republican perfectly reasonably asked me, why should I tell the people of my district to send their taxpayer dollars to Ukraine? To which I humbly replied, because as a member of NATO, it is ultimately cheaper than sending your sons and daughters. In that context, would the Defence Secretary agree with me that whilst we must respect American domestic politics, it's not for us to tell them what to do, this, again, is a time for the new world in all its power and might to come to the rescue and liberation of the old.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, because I'm aware of his work in Congress. In fact, I think we were there at roughly the same time last month, and in his clear explanations and lobbying of Congress in order to help release this money to Ukraine. And his point's absolutely right. The reason that this is in America's interest isn't just to come to the rescue of Europe, but it is because other despotic leaders, other autocrats, or other regimes of any type will be looking at whether we simply lose and give up because we get bored of the fight and then walk away. And they'll draw conclusions about that and decide whether, in fact, they can always take on the red line, the West, the no-go area, based on the fact all you have to do is wait it out. And that is why my honourable friend's absolutely right to say that it is indicatively in America's interest to step in here, because otherwise they will find it far more expensive in the future, perhaps in other parts of the world, to defend the world order.
Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And let me thank the Secretary of State for prior notice or sight of his statement and reiterate the unequivocal support of the SNP benches in the defence and the hopeful, we hope, liberation of the rest of Ukraine in their battle against Vladimir Putin. I know he recognises that part of being an opposition party is to highlight issues around this where we think there may be improvements. Now, I wanted to maybe highlight one, actually, I think it was alluded to by the Shadow Defence Secretary around supply chain issues. Now, it was actually Ed Conway of Sky who has been highlighting today around issues about sanction-busting exports from the UK, critically around heavy materials, notably car exports. And he goes on to say that, you know, we imagine if you're a Russian unit, Mr Deputy Speaker, relying on needing weapons, imagine you rely on certain parts or tools which traditionally came from the UK and would be directly imported to Russia, which can no longer happen. One of the solutions that Ed alludes to is the setting up of shell companies in friendly Caucasus states, as he states, notably Kyrgyzstan. Now, he does go on to allude that since the sanctions implemented not only by the UK, but other allies of Ukraine, there has been an export to Kyrgyzstan from the UK, an increase over 1,100% of the very materials that those frontline Russian troops need. And I wonder if he could advise the House if he will take that information away, engage with his Cabinet colleagues, and either in writing to myself or to the Defence Select Committee as to how the government seeks to block off those sanction-busting processes, and also highlighting to those companies who are participating in this that they are undervaluing the democratic value of the future of the Ukrainian nation.
Hear, hear.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for support from the SNP, adding to the weight of support from this House for Ukraine, and actually also for raising that issue. I did read at length the Ed Conway excellent thread this morning talking about this issue, and it is, I think, the case that when you set up sanctions, initially they tend to work, and then rather like water flowing around a boulder in a stream, they'll eventually work their way around and find another route to market. So I think it is very important that we continuously look at and assess whether those sanctions are doing the thing that we initially intended them to do. As Ed Conway points out in the thread, this is actually an international problem. He takes the UK example, but also extends it out and says it's happening elsewhere as well. So I can assure him that the British government will be taking a very close look at what's actually happening in reality. This is clearly a Treasury and an FCDO lead, but I do undertake to work with them, and I thank him for raising the issue.
Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can my right honourable friend just take this opportunity to emphasise that the light attendance in the House this afternoon is not an indication of any lack of resolve amongst members of this House or indeed of any of the political parties to stand up to President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which the Prime Minister recently described in the Liaison Committee as an existential threat to European and transatlantic security. Could he also share with the House where he believes there is evidence of an emboldening of Russian aggression, particularly perhaps towards Moldova, or indeed being threatened from Belarus, which appears to be preparing for an entry into this conflict? I wonder if he could shed any light on that.
On the first point, my right honourable friend's absolutely right. In fact, of course, it's a Thursday, and many members will have returned to their constituencies, but the Russian viewership of the chamber should not mistake the level of attendance with the level of interest. The reason why people have felt confident to return to their constituencies is because they know that there is no dispute in this House, as we've just heard, from across all sides, in our solid iron resolve for Ukraine. On the wider picture, look, I mean, members will see the news. They understand that with Putin, he simply murders those who stand up to him. He will go to any lengths. He turns his entire economy onto a whole war footing, and he tries to work with others, whether it's Belarus at the beginning or more recently with North Korea, Iran, and other pariah states in order to further his means. I better not go into the detailed intelligence on the floor of this House, though I'm sure more briefing can be announced. But it simply adds to the overall need for us to stick together, not just in this House, but in the civilised countries of the world, and make sure that Putin understands that no matter how long he carries on, we will always be there to help defend Ukraine.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and the Defence Secretary was certainly in full Duracell bunny mode today. But it's clear that Britain and this government has much to be proud of in our response to the Ukraine crisis. But it was also clear, right from the outset of the invasion, that this was going to be an industrial munitions war, harking back to the last century. But while Russia has got itself onto a full war economy footing, frankly, our government machine seems to have failed to mobilise British industry in the same way. And to highlight that, I will pose a simple question. Why did it take from February 22 to July 23 to place the vital order for additional desperately needed artillery shells?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I don't entirely agree with his characterisation of the UK response in terms of industrialisation. I do agree that overall it's quite difficult in a non-war footing to go from whatever level you're producing at to suddenly ramping this up. But it's heartening to know that I think I'm right in saying, and I'll correct these figures if I've got it wrong because it's from the top of my head, that our munitions and missile production is now at 8 times the level from before the war. So we have certainly stepped up. In addition, through the International Fund for Ukraine, which we established and is still receiving new contributions, I'm delighted to say Australia have just donated $50 million to that fund. We're carrying out rounds of procurement, and again, off the top of my head, 27 rounds of contract procurement so far. I'm not specifically familiar with the particular case that he cites, so I'll write back to him on that detail. But it's very encouraging that we've been able to set up a mechanism for other countries who've not had our scale of ambition and footprint with Ukraine to be able to put their own money into it and then buy in coalition on their behalf. And we'll continue to do that.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, myself and several other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee were in Warsaw speaking with members of the Polish government and British military and security officials based in that country. First of all, will he join me in paying tribute to British military officers for the work they are doing supporting Ukraine and our other allies like Poland and the Baltic states? And can he make comment on increasing Russian air incursions into NATO airspace of their missiles, which have already, sadly, last year killed 2 people, and with missile incursions taking place in relatively recent weeks, and what we can do to strengthen the air defences, not only to defend Ukraine against Russia's aggression, but also to ensure that democracy in Europe is strengthened.
Yeah.
Well, I thank my honourable friend and delighted that he was in Poland yesterday. The Poles, I should say, have been right on the front line next to Ukraine on this and have been tremendous in their support for Ukraine and also in their investment in their own defence sector. He's right also to highlight British military assistance in many different forms, much of which we can't discuss, but have certainly assisted in Poland and elsewhere in the region. He'll be pleased to hear that we have actually also contributed to Poland's own defence before their election provided 2 typhoons in order to prevent Putin from trying to escalate and exacerbate their election. We also provide other air defence mechanisms for Poland as well, and I'd be happy to provide a further briefing for the Honourable Member.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And on behalf of my party, the Liberal Democrats, I would very much like to thank the government for this statement and offer our wholehearted support to it. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev asked this week a rhetorical question: where to stop? Medvedev, who is now deputy head of Russia's Security Council, answered, "I don't know," and went on, "Will it be Kyiv? Yes, probably it should be Kyiv." He went on to make an outlandish claim that there is a threat to the Russian Federation from Kyiv, and he made some outrageous threats of his own, including to the UK. Will the Defence Secretary firstly condemn the ambiguity of Medvedev's rhetoric around Russia's ambitions? Secondly, rebut the wild claim that the Russian Federation is somehow threatened? And thirdly, ask his counterparts in Delhi and Beijing to urge Medvedev to halt his nuclear sabre-rattling?
Mr Deputy Speaker, absolutely. He's right to point out those irresponsible comments. They very much follow in the footsteps of the sort of thing that Putin goes around saying. It's completely irresponsible in the modern era to have world leaders go about threatening others. There is absolutely no justification whatsoever for an autocratic state or any state to walk into a democratic neighbour and claim it as their own, and to go further than that and to start threatening other states and to do it on a trumped-up charge that NATO somehow wishes to do the same in reverse is, as the whole House will know, complete fiction. NATO has no desire to do anything but to defend the existing borders, and that is why NATO is no threat whatsoever to Moscow.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Defence Secretary's statement? And he's absolutely right that the House is united in our support for Ukraine. And we should be proud of the UK Armed Forces personnel who've trained so many Ukrainian recruits. I think he said earlier that there'll be another 10,000 in the first half of this year, which is obviously welcome. I wonder if you can just take this opportunity to confirm that it obviously doesn't stop in the summer, and that our training programme, our vital training, will continue for as long as it takes for Ukraine to win the war.
Well, we're certainly always looking at the best way to train people, and my expectation is that it will continue, but we're always looking at how to improve it further. I mentioned before that our friends from Estonia and Latvia are joining us in that training, and so in a sense it sort of continues to expand. We always want to make sure that we're providing the training that they actually need. When you go and see this training, it is extraordinary to know that the fact that they've had this training in the UK dramatically improves their chances when they get to the front line towards the east of Ukraine. So clearly we will always want to do whatever we can to do more. And he's right to point out the figure was 10,000 for the first half of 2014, and plans will be assessed from there on.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I urge the Secretary of State to step up the pressure on his colleagues to shut down on sanctions evasion? My committee recently took evidence from the National Crime Agency that said that the UK is still one of the world's favourite places for economic crime and sanctions evasion. Companies House and the new identification regime that's being proposed is widely criticised by the stakeholders that we heard from. And of course we've got this whacking great loophole called limited partnerships, where the government is not currently proposing measures to shut them down. We've got to shut down the spigots of cash that are funding Putin's war machine, and we can play a role in that here in the UK as well.
I think the Honourable Gentleman's absolutely right about this. It's very important to ensure that, as I said before, sanctions after a period of time become whole, and that people are able to get around and through them. I've always taken a particularly tough line on just the basic principle that you shouldn't be friends with Putin and be able to benefit. Indeed, there's still at least one yacht and a couple of fast jets, or jets rather, private jets, which are grounded as a result of measures I took in the early days of the war when I was Transport Secretary. But his point is a wider one around seizing assets, and the way to make that work is to do it through the G7 and international partners to make sure it's completely solid. And again, as with these many other areas, we'll try to lead that debate, and as I promised the House before, we'll also look at what now isn't working, which may have worked initially, but I respect the work that he's been doing on it, and I certainly will encourage my colleagues in government to follow through.
I'd like to thank the Secretary